everyone. Welcome to the October 8th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona, and I'll be joined in just a second by my co-host, Craig Milkowski. This week on the podcast, we're going to take a look back at this final round of Breeders' Cup preps. I think we'll get a few more straggler stakes races coming up next weekend, but most of the major prep work for the Breeders' Cup is done at this point. Unlike the prior weekend, I don't think we saw any really outstanding performances this weekend, and the speed figures that we'll talk about really do reflect that. But these results that we're going to talk about did go a long way towards sorting out a lot of these divisions. We'll talk about the stakes from Belmont, Keeneland, Santa Anita. I think we're going to go through just about all of the major stakes races, and there's a lot to go through, so let's just get right down to it. Craig, ready to go through these stakes?
I am, and good to have you back. Save our listeners from having to listen to me ramble for 45 minutes like last week. Glad you're feeling better, and let's get to it.
All right. We're going to go division by division because I think it'll be good to compare some of these races as we march towards the Breeders' Cup. And we're going to start with the turf division, both the fillies and the colts. Let's begin with the Joe Hirsch Turf Classic they ran at Belmont on Saturday. Obviously a major prep race for the Breeders' Cup turf. This division has been a little bit muddled throughout the year, aside from Bricks and Mortar, who did not participate in this race. I wonder if Chad Brown's regretting that a little bit at this point, given how the race played out. But these horses behind Bricks and Mortar have just kind of been taking turns beating each other, and that was very much the case in this race, as Arklow, who had picked up a few seconds and thirds earlier in the year, got his turn in the winner's circle this day.
Yeah, it was, as you said, these horses outside of Bricks and Mortar, they just kind of keep beating each other. It's hard to get excited about them for me. From a figure standpoint, the top three actually both ran a 124, not surprising, given they were only a half length apart at the wire between the three of them. So it's a weird race. We actually have the fractions coded in red, and I've made a note to check that what's going on, because I didn't get that impression watching the race. The fractions don't really indicate it. And this is a distance that obviously doesn't get run too often. So I'm definitely going to give that a look, because I don't know how you feel, but it didn't look like a hot pace to me. And the way the horses finished would kind of bear that out.
Yeah, one of the things that I actually meant to look up, I meant to check the Trackus numbers, and I didn't do it. I'm actually pulling it up now. But one of the things I did notice about the race is that they really did pick up the pace before they got to the quarter pole. Coming around the far turn, Channelmaker, who was on the lead, they really started to apply the pressure at that point. And I think the penultimate quarter mile was actually faster than the final quarter mile, which is something you don't often see in these turf races. That said, we still didn't see anybody closing in the stretch. It was just sort of a merry-go-round race. It's frustrating to watch these races a lot of the time, because the horses that you sort of expected to be on the lead were just nowhere near the lead in the early going. And I am checking the Trackus numbers now, and I think they pretty much match up with what was posted. But as I was saying, a horse that you would think would be on the lead, like Cross Border, who was in the race coming out of, I think, a series of 6 furlong, mile, and a 16th races. And he had been right on top of the pace going 6 furlongs and 45 and change, yet he strangled back off a 50-4 half mile in this Joe Hirsch Turf Classic. I just don't quite understand the thinking like that, because Cross Border, given the race, the way the race played out, he arguably could have won. And I think his connections just squandered an opportunity there. The same for Ya Primo. I don't know what the deal was with him. He had shown speed in his prior starts, and it's like the connections wanted him to be last early. I just don't get the thinking behind the tactics in these races.
No, I'm with you. I always value speed, and I don't get it, especially the horse you mentioned first. So what was he doing in the race if he's not going to go to the lead? You could maybe see Ya Primo a little bit, as he just completely faltered last time after being part of a fast pace. So maybe try something new, but I agree. Sometimes I think there's a lot of overthinking going on in these races. Let's just let them run and see how it plays out.
Yeah, I don't want to spend too long on this race, because there are a lot you can discuss regarding the trips. And I'm actually going to highlight this race on my horses to watch video segment tomorrow, because I think it's an interesting one to discuss. But we can move on to the other major turf stakes from Belmont this past weekend, the one on Sunday for the fillies and mares, the Grade 1 Flower Bowl. No surprises here. Sister Charlie was, I think she went off at 1-5, and she basically never looked like a loser. I guess the only drama was how she was going to accomplish the victory, because she's got this rabbit, Thais, who just runs off in the early going. Seems like the other riders just basically ignore her at this point. Sister Charlie wasn't quite as impressive as in some other starts, but I also don't think she was ever losing this race.
No, I agree. And I've seen some people kind of knocking her performance and be down on it, but I just think this was a really weird, strange race. As you said, the rabbit is pretty pointless in these races where there's really no other pace anyway. I could see it when maybe Mitchell rode and there was another speed horse around. I forget who it was, but in here, nobody was going to the lead. Nobody was going to steal this race. If anybody was, it was probably Thais. I'm not sure why they didn't just let her keep rolling. She opened up that big lead through really not super fast fractions, and they kind of throttled her down. I don't know what the game plan was or if they really have any intent of even trying to win with this horse, but I wouldn't have been shocked if she would have been able to win if she'd opened up by 20 lengths, which she probably could have done here. But back to the top two, they ran good. I think Sister Charlie's clearly the dominant horse in this division. No real surprise there, and I'm not going to knock her a bit for this effort. I think she did what she had to do. She did it pretty easily, and on to the Breeders' Cup.
See, I kind of saw it the other way with Manny Franco's ride on Thais. I thought he was trying to win the race, actually, past the halfway point. I think he kind of looked around and was like, why is nobody following me? I'm going so slowly. And I think he kind of slowed the horse down, thinking like, she's got a kick to the finish. I could possibly win this race, because it's typically not a rider's strategy to try to open up by 20 and win on horses. I don't think most of them believe that works, even though it does. I saw them actually try to win the race with Thais, and she hung on for third and got another grade 1 placing. So, I mean, I guess riding her as a rabbit is actually working for her. I don't know how successful she'd be in shorter races at this top level. But Sister Charlie, I kind of agree with you. She probably didn't run her A race here. I don't think it was some kind of huge regression. I mean, the runner-up Mississippi she's okay. Maybe the figure seems a tad high to me because a couple horses that finished further down in the pack did actually improve their speed figures. I don't know what to make of that. That's just the nature of turf racing sometimes. But I wouldn't knock Sister Charlie at all off this performance going on to the Breeders' Cup. She's still way the horse to beat in the Breeders' Cup filly and mare turf, depending on who comes over from Europe.
Yeah, and talking about the figure, just real quick, we did get a lot of questions about this because there was another 10 furlong race on the card that was I think, a second faster or something. But this was clearly a situation. We talk about it a lot on both of our podcasts where turf races are just different. You really can't rate these races based on final time. Even Bayer, which are final time figures, they do the same thing. If you want your figures to have any kind of meaning when you go forward, you kind of got to use almost like class ratings where you're just looking at the fields in these aberrant pace situations. And we'll take a look at a fast pace race later where it was kind of the same thing. But there's no way these two races could be rated together, this and the earlier race on the card.
No, just to elaborate on that, I mean, people will compare the paces of these two races and say, oh, well, Thais was only going about a second slower to the 6 furlong marker than Red Right Hand, who won that earlier 10 furlong race in a faster time than Sister Charlie. But it's like Thais wasn't even in the race, and the rest of this field was probably running 2 to 3 seconds slower at every call than that other 10 furlong race. And it's just hard to make up that deficit in the final quarter mile. It's actually next to impossible. So I totally understand the decision to break this race out from the other one.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. That's how I did it. Like Thais wasn't even in there and went from there.
Moving on to another turf stakes at Belmont on Saturday, we saw the Grade 2 Hill Prince. I don't think this race is going to have any major implications for the Breeders' Cup, but it was an interesting race to at least discuss because these 3-year-old turf horses on the East Coast, which we've talked about quite a bit, they haven't really distinguished themselves. Kind of like the older turf division, they've taken turns beating each other quite a bit. And I guess it's no real surprise that a California Invader was able to take down this group because Neptune Storm came in with some competitive speed figures, some competitive races out west, and just got the right trip in another slow-paced race.
He did. He got a 118 for this, which is his best. And as you said, these horses back east just kind of took turns beating each other. So no real surprise a newcomer was able to come in and beat them. The race was definitely a bit of a merry-go-round. We don't have the fractions in blue, but just looking at the numbers, it was moderate at best. And the top 4 pretty much stayed 1, 2, 3, 4 around the track, other than the winner running down the runner-up in the late going. So pretty boring race from a visual standpoint. Nothing to get too excited about, as you say. With regards to the Breeders' Cup, maybe we'll see some of these horses when they run the 3-year-old turf races out at Del Mar. That used to be at Hollywood, but just can't see any of these in the Breeders' Cup personally.
No, and the way that they run these races has to be a little bit frustrating for you trying to make pace characterizations for these races, because you want to find what is a median pace going this distance. And if 75% of the races are slow paces, then a slow pace is the median. And I guess that's kind of the situation and why these fractions aren't color-coded in blue, because, I mean, most people would consider this to be a slow pace. It was certainly a race that favored horses that were on or near the lead. I guess we've just seen some even slower paces going this distance, which I guess is no real surprise if you watch a lot of two-turn races at Belmont Park and the way that the riders ride them. We did not see a slow pace in the Grade 1 First Lady, Keeneland. This was a pretty strong field. We've got a couple of Chad Brown's top older fillies and mares in this race in Uni and Rushing Fall. And we had talked about it on the forecast last week about how much speed was signed on for this race and how it was probably going to set up for Uni. And it really did play out that way on the racetrack, as they were just really flying up front. And Joel Rosario had Uni in the perfect spot towards the back of the pack, saved ground around the far turn, swung out in the stretch, and she just mowed them down.
Yeah, she did. She got a 124, which is a really good number for her. This race is kind of the opposite of the Sister Charlie race we talked about, and where the pace was so fast, it kind of break this one out in the other direction. This happens often at Keeneland on this day, where they run the First Lady and the Shadwell that we're going to talk about next, where the paces are just so far apart from each other that they're impossible to rate together. And it happened yet again this year. And this is one of those, if I rated them together, we'd probably have Uni up in the high 130s. But the problem with that is it would overrate all of the other horses, and it just isn't reality. It was just a pace, just as a slow pace can slow the final time. This kind of got what I like to call a false fast race, and that it was the pace that made it fast, not necessarily the horses. It was a perfect setup, as you said. This was one. We got a few right on Friday, and this was the one I think we pretty much nailed top to bottom on all the contenders. So I was happy with this one. Really nice call by you on Juliet Foxtrot to get second. And good race. I'm not sure what race she'll go in, maybe the Breeders' Cup Mile. I don't think the filly and mare turf is probably in her scope distance-wise, but she could be a contender in there, at least compared to the American horses she'll face.
Yeah, I was reading that Uni, she's not supplemented to the Breeders' Cup, but it sounds like this year they are strongly considering and favoring supplementing to the Breeders' Cup Mile, which I think is the right race for her. She really is a miling type. And I wonder if Chad Brown's going to kind of alter course with Bricks and Mortar a little bit, because it seems like the Breeders' Cup Mile, just among the American horses, might be coming up maybe the slightly tougher race than the turf. Obviously, the Euros could have a big influence on how those races end up turning out from a class standpoint. But I don't know if I'd want Bricks and Mortar running against a horse like Uni based off this performance. Maybe I'm being tricked a little bit by the fast pace and how visually impressive she was, but she looked really good in this race. I agree with you. Juliet Foxtrot ran fine too. She was a little bit closer to that fast pace and made that first move. So that's always a little tougher to do. And her speed figure certainly reflects that. She got a 123. The disappointment was Rushing Fall. Rushing Fall, to me, while she was successful coming from way off the pace as a 2-year-old, she just wants to be on the lead or up close to the pace. She just doesn't seem to be quite as effective coming from further back in the pack. And I'm going to owe her poor performance here up to that. It's not like she ran terribly. She was fourth, but this was not her A race.
No, and like we said, we talked about her. It was kind of predictable. She was going to be further back than she liked. And I'm not sure where to go with her. I wouldn't go to the Breeders' Cup personally, because she'd most likely find herself in the same situation. And I'm sure Chad Brown, they'll find a good spot for her.
Yeah, I'd imagine they'd go into a race like the Matriarch, though it seems like Chad Brown has about 10 horses for that race, so we'll sort them out. Speaking of that other 1 mile Grade 1 race at Keeneland on Saturday that you were mentioning, with the slower pace than the Shadwell Turf Mile, this race, we talked about it beforehand as being just totally wide open, and it really played out that way on the racetrack, just kind of like the First Lady looked. I was shocked to see that there was actually a 2-1 favorite in this race, and Valid Point, who, I thought should have been about 5 times that price, if not more, given his speed figures coming in. But they really just homed in on him and ignored everybody else, which gave you a pretty nice price on Bowie's Hero at the end of the day, 8-1. He made a lot of sense in this race, and he got the right trip. He was somewhere in mid-pack, really got that unencumbered run to the race, which is what you want in a pretty congested field like this. I thought Diamond Oops ran well to be second, but just a blanket finish and a race that I don't think is going to have major Breeders' Cup implications.
No, I would tend to agree. 123 for Bowie's Hero, which is pretty much what he runs all the time, right in the 120s when he runs well. Like you said, it was a good effort. It was interesting to see. We kind of talked about Friday, the big trainers out west on turf are Phil D'Amato and Richard Baltus, and both were able to ship east this week and win major races. So maybe things are changing with the West Coast horses. Well, I'd have to see a little more than this, but maybe the division's getting a little stronger with those two solid trainers. The horse that really intrigued me in here, not necessarily from a Breeders' Cup standpoint, is Diamond Oops, who kind of came out of nowhere. I believe it was behind Imperial Hint when he ran that really good second at huge odds. And then he went back to turf, and he just seems like he's a new horse since he's been gelded. He came back this year gelded, started out a little slow, but his last two races have been lights out, and considering they were sprinting on dirt and routing on turf, particularly if you look at this race, he was the only horse anywhere near the lead within shouting distance at the wire, and he was able to finish second. So I think he's a dangerous horse wherever he shows up next.
He really did start out, I think, as more of a turf horse. Well, he started out as a dirt horse. He ran in some turf stakes after that. I think he was actually fifth in the Jaipur behind World of Trouble and didn't even run that badly in that race. But I guess going the mile on turf is what he really wants to do, because this was arguably his best race. He was kind of with the track in the Vanderbilt behind Imperial Hint, but he ran well there too. So a really versatile, fun horse. I thought Sway Dwa ran fine to be third. Couldn't believe he was 20-1. I thought that was absolutely insane. But he ran fine, and I guess he'll go on to the Breeders' Cup Mile once again. But just a blanket finish. And when you have all these horses so close at the wire, typically says this wasn't that strong of a race. And I would kind of tend to lean in that direction. Sticking with this division and moving on to California, we saw the City of Hope Mile, another Grade 2 event. I guess this race might produce some runners or a runner or two for the Breeders' Cup Mile, given that it's the local prep race. But kind of like the Shadwell Turf, a really blanket finish, a surprising result. As True Valor came off a pretty long layoff to get up. He got a great trip, but I'm not sure how well he ran or the others in behind him.
Yeah, this is a race. Talk about a tight race. The top 8 were within a length and a half at the wire. So it just said not exactly a powerhouse race. I'm sure some of them will probably try the Breeders' Cup, as you said, given it'll be in California this year, but not a whole lot to say. My only regret here is I ignored the last top speed figure at 16-1, which True Valor had. But, that was mostly based on he hadn't run since early February. Probably overlooked him a bit. But, again, not the strongest of races. And, let's go. Move on from this one.
Yeah, no, the disappointment was Prince Earl, who looked so good at Del Mar, and he just didn't really continue that momentum forward in his second start off the layoff, unfortunately, because he looked like he might be a budding star out in California. He just wasn't able to duplicate that effort at Santa Anita. Moving on to a different division, we saw the final prep for the Breeders' Cup Distaff on Sunday at Keeneland, the Grade 1 Spinster. Now, this race was supposed to be the showdown between the top older filly, or older mare, I should say, Elate, and the top 3-year-old filly, Dunbar Road, but there was a spoiler in the mix as Blue Prize has just kind of steadily been improving this year, and she's been a little camera shy in the past, but she's now put together 2 consecutive victories. We'll talk about how the track was playing a little bit, but she got the right trip and just ran them down.
She did. I thought this was a pretty strong race overall. The top 2 got 123s. Dunbar Road got a 122 back in third. Certainly didn't disgrace herself and prove she could run with the older horses. I am a little not concerned. I'm a little interested in what you think about the track. I didn't get to see all the races this week. I was traveling, but I've watched some, and I want to do some more work. But it seemed like a lot of the races at Keeneland had an outside flow to them. So if that is the case and the rail wasn't exactly the best place to be, I'd even be willing to upgrade Dunbar Road's effort a little bit.
Yeah, I didn't watch all the dirt races on Sunday, but I did watch most of the races from Saturday and some from Friday. And it just seemed like throughout the entire weekend, you probably didn't want to be right down on the rail on the dirt. I know a few horses ran pretty well down towards the inside, but the majority of the races really did seem to feature outside flows, and it didn't seem to be a symptom or a result of paces most of the time. And I think that was the case in the Spinster. That said, it's not like Elate was inside in this race, so I don't know what Elate's excuse was, but Dunbar Road, she was right down on the rail for most of the way, and Javier Castellano tried to squeeze through inside at the top of the stretch, mostly because he just had no other option given her trip. And I guess you could make the case that Dunbar Road should have finished a little higher in this race. She didn't have to overcome that adversity. I thought she actually ran pretty well because she did improve her speed figure in this spot and step up against the older horses. Elate, though, I mean, it wasn't a disaster. She lost by half a length. Her speed figure just dropped off a little bit, but this was a race that she was supposed to win if they're considering races like the Breeders' Cup Classic for her.
Yeah, it was a little disappointing, and I personally think this distaff's probably going to be a little more open than people think. Midnight Bisou has obviously been impressive visually, but her figures aren't anything to write home about. I mean, they're decent, but she's not like she's running 130s or anything like that. So I think this race is going to be something. I'm not sure where Elate's going to go. I guess you could try the Classic if you just want to say that the distance was the problem here, but I'm not really convinced of that. I'm not saying she doesn't like 10 furlongs more than 9, but I'm not sure that extra furlong would translate to a top effort against older male colts.
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't think she's that much better going longer, that she'd improve so much going the 1.25 miles. And Blue Prize, I mean, she's in the mix because I think people forget sometimes that she only lost the Breeders' Cup Distaff behind Monomoy Girl by a length and a half last year. She was right there at the end of that race. So she's always been a good horse. She hasn't necessarily won these big races. She was a repeat winner of the Spinster, so it seems like maybe she just comes alive in the fall. But she's in good form. And as you said, there are 3-year-old fillies out there who are really stepping up at this point. So I agree with you. I think this Breeders' Cup Distaff could be a pretty fascinating race. We'll head on to the sprint division on the dirt. And I think one of the most talked about races from this past weekend was the feature at Santa Anita on Saturday, as Omaha Beach came back from the layoff, cut all the way back to 6 furlongs, and got the better of Chancelot in the Santa Anita Sprint Championship. I think a lot of us really questioned this decision by Richard Mandella to cut all the way back and try this major sprint race. But he was vindicated because it really worked out.
It did. It was quite an effort. It surprised me. I figured Chancelot would be all alone, which he was. I was a little surprised by the pace. I don't think there's any doubt the pace was slow. We have all the fractions coded in blue. And I would really like to see Chancelot just, let him run and see what this horse can do, make the others keep up. I think a horse coming off a long layoff like Omaha Beach might have had a little bit more trouble if he had to work early, but they basically turned this into a 1/4 mile sprint to the wire, and having to outrun a horse like Omaha Beach is just something Chancelot wasn't able to do. Omaha Beach got a 124 for the effort. The final time was actually 128. And this is actually a card my figure-making partner, and I discussed quite a bit. And it actually could have been 3-4 points higher, but this is where we decided to go. We had a minor variance split mid-card. But had we not, it could have even been a little faster. So the top 2, I thought, ran very well. It's probably all we really need to talk about in here. I mean, Flagstaff's okay. We know what he is at this point, but it will be interesting to see where Omaha Beach goes in the Breeders' Cup. They've talked about all 3, the Sprint, the Mile, and the Classic, and I'm really curious to see where he shows up. I mean, we know where Chancelot's going, and I'm not going to write him off. I just wish they get a rider that would just let him go from the wire, use his speed, open up that edge, and see if he can hold on.
I don't know what to make of Chancelot. I'm starting to think that he's never going to repeat that Amsterdam back at Saratoga, because in the Alan Jerkins last time, I was a little critical of Misael Jaramillo for not being that aggressive with him in the early going and trying to slow the pace down. In this race, though, I mean, it looked like he was letting Chancelot run, and Chancelot just wasn't taking him there the way that he did in the Amsterdam. I mean, in that Amsterdam, when you watch it back, it's like this horse is powered by jet fuel, and he just didn't look that way in this race and never seemed like he was willingly opening up on the field the way that he did in that race 3 back. So I just wonder if maybe that race took a lot out of him. Sometimes horses don't run back to those big efforts. I'm not a big believer in bounces, but sometimes horses they don't continue to progress after a top effort. And that just seems like maybe what's happened to Chancelot. He'll run back in the Breeders' Cup Sprint, I assume, and he's a contender in that race. I just don't know if we're going to see that kind of breakout performance again. And Omaha Beach, I think it's a really fascinating discussion about what they do with him from here, because he showed early in the year he obviously doesn't have a whole lot of stamina limitations. I would think that the Breeders' Cup Sprint is probably the worst option for him, because this race featured a pretty slow pace and he was able to sit close to it. He's going to get pretty badly outrun, I would think, in the early portions of a fast-paced Breeders' Cup Sprint. So to me, that's not the right spot. I guess the dirt mile is the safe option, but if I were part of owning this horse, I would definitely point to the Classic, because if you look at the current lineup of contenders for the Classic, there's no speed. There are literally no front runners pointing to the Classic. I mean, I'm interested to see what the pace projector predicts when we put out the TimeformUS advanced PPs. But I mean, to me, it looks like maybe McKinsey's the speed, Vino Rosso, Mongolian Groom, maybe higher power, but there are just no other speed horses aside from maybe those four pointing to the Classic. So I would say just put Omaha Beach on the lead in the Classic and see what he can do.
Yeah, I'm with you 100% on that. If he were my horse, which, I'd never be lucky enough to own a horse like that, but that's where I'd go, because the upside is so high. Is he really going to increase his value much by winning the Breeders' Cup Sprint or the Dirt Mile? Probably not. But the Classic, if he wins, he almost guarantees the 3-year-old Eclipse, and he might even be Horse of the Year with a win there. I mean, it's hard to knock his campaign. Sure, he had some time off, but to come back and win a couple of Grade 1s, right off the layoff after he had already won a couple big races earlier in the year, given this year, he would certainly be a major contender. So I trust the trainer to point him to the right spot. And if he thinks he's up for the Classic, let him go and let's see what he's got.
Yeah, I agree with that. Moving on to some other sprint races on the dirt, races that I think we can go through pretty quickly because I don't think they're going to have a major impact on the Breeders' Cup. The Grade 2 Phoenix at Keeneland from Friday, a race that was a minor upset with Engage winning. I wasn't a big fan of this horse when he was in Chad Brown's barn. I don't think he's really improved a whole lot for Steve Asmussen. I just think he got the right trip in this race. Maybe Whitmore was best after that slow break, but I wasn't that impressed by any performance in this race.
No, it was not a strong race. The winner got a 117, which for Grade 2 older males is just not a very good race. So Whitmore ran okay in his first race since June, where he had disappointed the last couple times out, but nothing special, nothing that would make me think he's a Breeders' Cup contender. My only two real takes out of this are negative kind. Promise is fulfilled. Something seems to be amiss. He's clearly not the horse he was last year. And obviously, Hog Creek Hustle's a 3-year-old that just needs a perfect setup that he didn't get in here. So nothing too exciting for me in this one.
Yeah, and this was another one of those races at Keeneland that kind of would lead you to believe that the rail might not have been the place to be, because it did have a significant outside flow to it, as did to an extent the Thoroughbred Club of America, the TCA stakes that we saw on Saturday, where Spice Perfection, kind of like Whitmore, overcame a pretty poor start to get up to win. Even though Whitmore didn't win, he ran quite well. But Spice Perfection got the job done here, although I think she was helped by the fact that just nobody else showed up in this race. I mean, for Dawn the Destroyer to be second and running on strongly ahead of the rest of this field, I think that's really an indictment of the rest of this group. I will say the speed figure does seem very low for a Grade 2 race at this level, but just visually watching it, I guess I kind of understand.
Yeah, that's the one note I have here. I wrote down how low the figure came back, and it's almost too low to believe. So I am going to give this race another long look today and really dive down into it. I was a little hesitant at first, but sometimes when you see it actually on paper in the charts, it gives you pause. So I will definitely look at it again, and I'll post it if I make any changes. But that said, any changes I make are not going to elevate these horses into Breeders' Cup contenders, that's for sure. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time worrying about it. We did have the fractions in red. So, I mean, if you want anybody out of here, I guess just because of the trip, it would be Spice Perfection, but I can't see it personally.
No, we basically know who the top contenders for the Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Sprint are at this point, and they're not coming out of this race, nor are they coming out of the LA Woman, which is run out at Santa Anita. Lady Ninja got the job done here. Look, she's an admirable optional claiming type of horse. I've never really thought of her as a graded stakes type. I guess she's improved a little bit recently, but the others in this race just didn't really seem to show up with their top efforts, and that allowed her to get the job done by a nose. But again, not a race where I really want these horses moving forward into a Grade 1 event.
No, Lady Ninja only got a 111, which is about what she normally runs, probably aided by what was a fast pace. I guess if you want anybody out of here, it will be Selcourt, who actually got a 116 in second. She was coming off a 6-month layoff, and I thought she ran okay. Maybe there's a little room for improvement from her. Anonymity, she just keeps getting bet, but she just isn't very good. I think a lot of people were fooled by her Breeders' Cup third last year. And they think she's better than she is, but she's never been all that good of a filly. She just kind of tripped into that third in the filly and mare sprint. So another one, not very exciting. I assume maybe we'll see Selcourt in the filly and mare sprint, and maybe she'll be a pace factor, but that's about it.
I think we're going to see a pretty big disparity in quality between the filly and mare sprint that we saw last year and the filly and mare sprint that we're likely going to see this year. And some of the horses that were considered contenders in the race last year just probably are a little bit out of their league this time around, with horses like Kofefi and Come Dancing out there. So interesting to see how that race is going to shape up, but I don't necessarily want any of these horses. Moving on to the turf sprint division, we saw two of the major preps for the Breeders' Cup turf sprint. The Woodford at Keeneland on Saturday. Pretty interesting race to talk about from a trip standpoint, because they were really flying through the opening quarter mile. And then as horses were trying to make the runs through the stretch, a couple of them found traffic trouble. One who didn't, though, was the 3-year-old Stubbins, who Joel Rosario just gave a perfect ride to, cut the corner, got him outside in the stretch, and he just ran the field down. But I would say he was a little bit of a lucky winner.
He was a bit of a lucky winner. I think it just said Imprimis had trouble. Extravagant Kid had a ton of trouble. He, to me, looked like he was going to win the race if he could get through, but he just couldn't get through. And that's the dangers of trying to ride the rail in these behind horses in these short turf races. Horses don't often get as tired as they do going longer and don't drift and leave that opening. So, but I don't want to knock Stubbins too much. He's a 3-year-old who, since he tried a route, didn't run particularly well. He's moved back to one turn, and he ran at Kentucky Downs, ran a surprising second behind his stablemate, and got a 116 that day, and he got a 122 here. So I think he's going to be a pretty dangerous horse in the sprint. He did get a good setup, as you said, but he's likely to get another one in the Breeders' Cup turf sprint. Hard to say who's going to show up. The foreign shipper, who was probably going to take the most money, Batash, didn't run very well at all in Paris on Arc Day. So it looks like he probably won't be coming for the turf sprint. So it's a pretty wide open race. I imagine it'll draw a lot of speed. So I may keep Stubbins on my tickets. We'll just have to see how it looks.
He's not a horse that I would toss by any stretch. I just thought he was a little bit lucky to win this race, and maybe the result would have been different if horses like you were mentioning, Imprimis and Extravagant Kid in particular, had got different trips. Maybe they could have won. It's hard to say because they did encounter trouble about an eighth of a mile out and lost their momentum. But I thought this was a decent race overall. I thought the winner ran well. And I don't want to give short shrift to Leinster, who was second, who got back on track here after a disappointing performance last time. He got back to the form that he showed at Saratoga over the summer. So he's in the mix too. And I think that we'll see a few contenders in the Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint coming from this race. Moving on to the Belmont Turf Sprint Championship. This is not a graded race, but I thought it featured a couple of decent performances. Shecky Shabazz, who was the favorite here, I think he was exposed a little bit this time. We had talked on the forecast last week about how he was winning the lucky coin at Saratoga last time. It was probably a little bit phony because of the slow pace of that race, and I think that really played out here as Final Frontier was right on top of them for most of the race. Shecky Shabazz got a little bit of pressure on the front end, and that proved to be his undoing as Final Frontier just was able to run him down in the final eighth.
He was. What I found interesting, I think the pace figure was almost identical to his race at Saratoga for that opening quarter. But the difference, as you said, for one, he got a little pressure, and the other was just that extra half furlong, which I think we both commented that these are definitely different races than 5.5 at Saratoga. So He got a 120 running in second. The winner got a 119. I'm not sure Final Frontier is the kind of horse that's going to be a 5 furlong horse. Maybe Shecky Shabazz is. He will certainly be a pace factor if they decide to send him to the Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint, which maybe they will with the announcement that Jason Service's other horse, it's a World of Trouble, is not going to make the race. So maybe he'll be in there and be a pace factor, but he's not a horse I'd want to beat having to run much faster early to get his preferred front running position.
That's going to be a difficult race to work out the right trip at Santa Anita. I'm not sure that that's the right race for Final Frontier. Shecky Shabazz, I just question his quality a little bit, but I understand why they might take a shot in that race. But I kind of am with you that this race is probably not going to produce one of the top contenders for the Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint. Even though I do like Final Frontier as a horse, I just don't think that's the right spot for him. This is probably the end of the line for Disco Partner. Disco Partner just didn't run at all in this race, didn't come up with any kind of closing kick. I'll be a little surprised if we see him again after a performance like this, but he's had a great career. So if this is the end, I mean, we can just look back on all of his great performances because he was good for a really long time.
Yeah, he was, and his name will probably be in the record book for a while for that turf sprint he ran at. I think it was at Belmont where he set the world record. So going to be tough to beat. He was a cool horse, and maybe he'll come back, but I think he's probably earned his time off.
Let's move on to the 2-year-olds because I think this is where we got the most clarity this past weekend since a lot of these divisions were pretty muddled and we got some answers to some questions in these races. We'll begin with the Breeders' Futurity from Keeneland. This was a race that had a pretty impressive winner that I don't think everybody saw coming. Gouverneur Morris was the big favorite in this race. Maxfield did take a little bit of money coming off his 1-mile debut win at Churchill, but I don't think people were expecting this kind of performance because he made this a Rossi-like move coming around the far turn. Looked like he was going to engage Gouverneur Morris at the top of the stretch, but then he just ran right by that horse, quickly opened up. This horse really announced his presence in this race.
He did. This was a strong effort. He ran a 106 after a 94 in his debut. And I think we kind of talked about horses like this on the forecast, that you got to watch out for these 2-year-olds. They can easily improve their speed figures, and especially when they show an ability to make up ground as distances get longer. With older horses, we don't really like horses closing sprinters, stretching out, but I think it's a bit different with 2-year-olds. That said, I wasn't smart enough to bet this horse. I thought it was a 2-horse race, and I couldn't have been more wrong. He won so easily. I thought Gouverneur Morris ran okay. He got a 101. Nothing special, but Maxfield was clearly best, and I think he'll be a threat in the Breeders' Cup.
Yeah, the only caveat is that he was, once again, another horse that rallied on the outside of Keeneland and did seem like that was where you wanted to be, although he was very impressive in doing so I wouldn't detract from the performance too much. And he definitely seems like one who's not going to have any trouble with added distance. So an intriguing contender for the Breeders' Cup Juvenile. One horse who's not a contender for the Breeders' Cup Juvenile because he's unlikely to run there is the Champagne winner, Tiz the Law. Kind of like Maxfield, he was coming off a pretty impressive debut win, although Tiz the Law's debut win came up very fast. I think he'd gotten a 111 TimeformUS speed figure for that New York bred win at Saratoga. It was pretty ambitious for Barclay Tagg to step him right up against Graded Stakes Company, against Open Company, something he did not do with his other top horse from years ago, Funny Side. But Tiz the Law handled the step up in class with ease, really. I mean, he looked like a winner every step of the way. Coming around the far turn, you could see that Manny Franco was just totally loaded with horse, and once he worked him into the clear, he just ran away.
He did, and he got a 105 for the effort. Very, very good race, I thought. I thought he was still a bit green. Curious to see what you think about that. I thought Green Light Go just ran okay. He obviously didn't run as good as the first 2 times out, but he did miss a little time. And maybe he's a horse that doesn't really want to be on the lead. So if you want to give him a pass, I could see it. But Tiz the Law was just much the best. We talked about his maiden race on this show, which we didn't talk about a whole lot of New York bred maiden races, but he was that impressive. And not sure where he's pointed to next. Like you said, I don't think it's going to be the Breeders' Cup, but he's definitely one to follow because he looks like he has a world of talent.
Yeah, and this horse, I should say, is just a New York bred in name only because he really does have a classic Kentucky pedigree. He's by an excellent sire, and the dam side has produced a ton of classy horses. So this horse, I'm not going to be surprised if he's a major contender moving on to the Derby preps next year. And Barclay Tagg is just going to try to get there the way that he knows best. And I can't really blame him for skipping the Breeders' Cup because, as you said, he's a horse who's still a little bit green. He didn't even have a ton of training time into this race. So if this one took a lot out of him, I guess they want to give him a little more time. As for Green Light Go, something I talked about with this horse earlier is that despite his physical makeup and the way that I guess he sort of presents himself, he really is not bred to stretch out beyond sprints. His dam was just a true sprinting type. He's by hard spun. He might just not be the kind of horse that is going to end up getting better with more distance. So we'll see. Maybe he just didn't like the trip he got in this race, although I actually thought it was a fine trip. But he did not step forward. A little disappointing. But the winner, 'Tis the Law, I think he's the real deal. Talking about the fillies now, at Keeneland, we saw the Alcibiades on Friday. This was a race that looked a little bit wide open coming in because the probable favorite, Perfect Alibi, she had won some graded stakes races, but I don't think people were too impressed by her wins up at Saratoga. And it was actually another horse coming out of a race at Saratoga, British Idiom, who had won, I believe, one of those restricted maiden races for horses who sold or RNA'd for $45,000 or less. Well, she stepped right up out of one of those races and won a grade 1 here and did it pretty decisively.
Yeah, I had down this is probably the most impressive 2-year-old effort of the weekend, I thought. She was up pretty close to what was a decent fast pace. We even have the half mile coded in red. And she just ran away from Perfect Alibi, Alondra, and then the rest were just way back. And the way she did it, she looked very professional, looked like she could go on. And I was really impressed by her race. 104 TimeformUS. Perfect Alibi got a 96 back in second. Losing a bit of ground in here, but not sure that was necessarily a bad thing. I'll talk more about her figure when we talk about Frank's Rocket in the next race. So good effort from me from the winner, and curious to see if she'll show up in the Breeders' Cup because she looked every bit as good as Bass did to me.
Yeah, and it seems like all of these 2-year-old fillies that are coming out of Kentucky, California, and New York have run pretty similar speed figures. So that should be an interesting race to handicap because it doesn't seem like there's a real standout at this point. I know that horse, that maiden winner at Santa Anita, Donna Veloce, has gotten a lot of hype out of that race. We'll see if they do end up running in the Breeders' Cup with her. She ran a little bit faster, but no, all these horses that have won these grade 1 races, I think they're running pretty similar numbers. And I agree with you, British Idiom, she looked great. Alondra, I know some people were upset with the ride and the fact that they showed absolutely zero aggression with her after she had won in gate-to-wire fashion in her debut. Probably, I'm guessing Shug McGahee wasn't that upset because she got a great education in this race, learning how to rate and come through horses. We'll see if they go to the Breeders' Cup with her. I don't know if she really earned her ticket here based on this effort, losing by about 10 lengths. But she's one that I could see people latching on to for the future because she is likely to go forward from here. Moving on to the Frizette, we saw another horse coming out of a maiden win, or debut win actually, at Saratoga, step right up against grade 1 company and get the job done, and that was Wicked Whisper. She debuted pretty late in the Saratoga meet, but she was one of the more visually impressive winners that we saw up there. She's a horse that's definitely bred to stretch out because she's a half sister to Point of Honor, who probably wants to go 1.25 miles. And Wicked Whisper looked like there'd be more pace in this Frizette than actually developed. And I think that really worked to her favor, the ability to set a pretty moderate pace up front.
Yeah, she set a moderate pace, not coded in blue, but definitely the figures were increasing. The final time figures, the fastest one in a running line. And not only was it moderate, she was clear. She never really got any pressure. I thought she ran okay. I thought Frank's Rocket ran pretty well, but we talked about her on our forecast that she's probably a horse that doesn't want to go this far. And that's basically how she runs. She kind of made that move look like she might be a threat and then just flattened out through the stretch, easily held second. So good effort from the winner. I'm not sure where we'd see the runner-up show up. And as you said, she got a 105, so she kind of fits right in with all the others we've talked about both this week and last week.
Yeah, I think people might perceive her as having more upside because in both of her races so far, she's just won very easily, hasn't really been set down, just kind of eases across the wire without the rider having to really take the whip out. So maybe she can run faster. I don't always subscribe to that point of view, but she certainly is one who's bred to get better with distance. So I think she's right in the mix with all the others, and maybe she's arguably the favorite. We'll see how that all shakes out by Breeders' Cup time. Let's move on to the turf divisions with the 2-year-olds, because you saw a lot of races for the 2-year-olds on the turf this past weekend. We'll start with the Grade 3 Bourbon, prep for the juvenile turf, and a large field in this race, mostly dominated towards the front end, as Peace Achieved overcame a bit of a wide trip to get the job done here.
Yeah, she did. It's got a 101 TimeformUS speed figure. Let me caveat this by saying both Santa Anita and Keeneland ran several 2-year-old turf races this weekend, so these figures were definitely a bit tough to make. They're not ones I'm going to be betting like they're etched in stone, because when all of the races are for lightly raced 2-year-olds, I really have my work cut out for me. But I thought this was a good effort. We had the 6 furlong coat in red. It wasn't that big of a hot pace, I don't think. The top 3 or 3 of the top 4 were running up close early. And the Vitalogy is, I guess that's how you say that, was the only one who really came flying, and he really made up a lot of ground. So if I had to pick one out of here to watch going forward, that would be the one. He made up a lot of ground in a race nobody else was.
Yeah, I agree with that. I was going to highlight him because he was breaking from the 14 post, had to go very wide around the far turn to make that run, and was still coming at the end to easily the fastest of all. I mean, he was actually getting to the winner at the end of that race, whereas at the 8th pole, it looked like he was going to lose by about 2 lengths. He really kicked it into the end. I thought the first and third place finisher got very good trips. Peace Achieved was a little bit wide. The third place finisher, Gear Jockey, really had no excuse. I mean, he cut the corner at the top of the stretch when the leader drifted out, and just nobody else aside from Vitalogy closed. So I thought he ran very well. And I believe Vitalogy was coming out of a race. I'm forgetting what his PPs look like now, but he is a horse that I think did he finish behind Decorated Invader in the summer? I'm forgetting now if he's the same horse that I'm thinking of. But he looks like a contender for the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Turf because this race came up reasonably fast. I'm not sure who else is out there aside from Structru, who we saw win the Pilgrim last weekend. But another division that seems pretty wide open.
It does, and it was Decorated Invader that he finished third behind at Woodbine in his first race here in North America. So, pretty solid effort. It's really hard to get too hooked on these juveniles this early until we see what's going to come over from overseas. And you can say that about a lot of these turf races. We know we're going to get a heavy European influence, especially they seem to really like going out to California and Santa Anita. But I thought this was a good effort, especially by Vitalogy, as you said, and I'm looking forward to seeing where, and hopefully he draws better.
Another race in the juvenile turf division that we saw run this past weekend was the Zuma Beach out at Santa Anita. These California 2-year-old turf stakes generally don't produce top contenders for the Breeders' Cup, but since the Breeders' Cup is in California this year, we'll discuss it. While this race didn't come up that fast, I did think that Hit the Road, the winner of the Zuma Beach, was pretty visually impressive because he just kind of looped the field around the far turn and really did draw off with authority in the stretch. I'm just not sure what was behind him in this race.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I haven't published the figure yet, but looking at the worksheet, it's going to be about an 89, which really is nothing special. The pace wasn't hot or slow. It's not going to have any color-coded fractions. So I'll take it for what it's worth. He did look good. He's 2 for 2 on turf. He was able to loop the field, but not really a horse I'd want in the Breeders' Cup with the competition he's going to have to face.
Moving on to the sprint division to wrap things up, the juvenile turf sprint division, that is. We saw a horse that I think some people were considering maybe the early favorite for that race, Kimari. She had gained a lot of hype when she went to Royal Ascot and just barely lost the Queen Mary, a pretty prestigious race for the 2-year-olds there. And she came back and beat an overmatched field at Saratoga, but looked great doing it. And she was supposed to win this Indian Summer against the Colts pretty easily, based on her prior form. I don't think that Wesley Ward was necessarily expecting that she'd be last in the early going. There was a ton of speed in this race on paper, but she just really couldn't kick with them early. And Mike Smith, to his credit, didn't panic, just let her settle at the back of the pack, wheeled her out to the far outside at the head of the lane, and she just ran them down. But it was a race that really fell apart at the end.
It was. I got a 95 TimeformUS speed figure. We had the early quarter mile coated in red. I'm not sure what to make of this filly. I guess you got to give her extra credit for the versatility. She's won wire to wire. Now she's come last to first, but she hasn't run particularly fast. So she's a horse that if she winds up being favored in the juvenile turf sprint, I'll probably look elsewhere. I mean, Wesley Ward's always dangerous with these, and it wouldn't surprise me if she ran well, but she just hasn't been fast enough for my liking.
Yeah, it's funny because her big performance came overseas. I'm assuming that race is rated pretty highly, and her two subsequent performances in the U.S. just haven't been quite that fast. We'll see what we get from her. It's a little concerning to me that she seemingly lost her early speed in this race because that's typically not the way that these Wesley Ward horses run. Maybe that's going to help her in the Breeders' Cup where she's unlikely to make the lead, but that's just always a little concerning for me when they're not as quick out of the gate as they were. But she is talented, so I don't want to take that away from her.
Yeah, her rating from Ed Ascot was just a 96 when we take out the weight for age part. So in our PPs, it showed up as a 96. So she improved a little bit on that, but nothing to get too excited about.
Yeah, the other thing I wanted to mention about this race is that Chimney Rock, who was second, he won one of those restricted maiden races at Saratoga. I didn't feel like he ran that well in his subsequent start at Kentucky Downs, and I'm just not sure how good that horse really is. And they both got similar trips, and she only beat him by half a length. So I just don't know how much we're really supposed to upgrade her performance for coming from off the pace when another horse who I don't think is that great got basically the same journey as her. So we'll see. Maybe she can step forward next time. Moving on to New York, we saw a couple of preps for the turf sprint, one for the Colts and one for the fillies. The horse that maybe gets a little upgraded in Wesley Ward's barn out of this race is Four Wheel Drive, who had been impressive when he made his debut in a stakes race at Colonial Downs last time. And he really duplicated that performance and actually stepped forward a little bit here to win the Grade 3 Futurity. I thought this was a decent field, and he's the one that stepped up, got a good trip, stalking just a horse that sort of ran off unexpectedly in the early going. But he ran a fast time, and I think he's a top contender for the Breeders' Cup.
Yeah, I would take him over Kamari personally. He got 100 for the effort. And what I really liked is he was able to sit off that lone leader. He showed he's a professional horse. He was able to rate off that speed and close him down. And he didn't just pass him. I mean, he was drawing away at the end. So I don't really care for too much else in this field if we're talking Breeders' Cup, but I would certainly consider him a contender.
No, whenever you're winning these turf sprint stakes by open lengths, I think that really is an indicator that you put in a dominant performance. So he's a horse that I would definitely strongly consider, regardless of which Euros come over, because as we've talked about quite a bit, the juvenile turf sprint isn't always the best race for the European shippers. So I think the American contingent might be pretty strong this year, especially with Wesley Ward's horses in the mix. We'll see if the filly that won the matron ends up going to the Breeders' Cup. Alms. They were writing her back pretty quickly off her debut victory, which came, I believe, in the middle of September at Belmont. I was really impressed with that maiden win. Not quite as impressed with this matron victory because I really didn't think a whole lot of this field. I didn't like Wesley Ward's horse that much, and she did not show up. And the rest of the horses were basically just dirt horses trying the turf. And Alms did run them down, took a little bit of encouragement to do so. She had to go a little bit wide on the turn. I was just hoping to see more of a figure progression from her.
Yeah, she only got a 92 here. This race was kind of a yawner. She was a heavy favorite, wins with an unimpressive number, and just not one I'm going to be excited about. I'd be shocked if they sent her to the Breeders' Cup off of this effort. They could probably find better spots for her.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I wouldn't even be surprised if she might want to go a little bit farther in the future because she's not a horse that I think turning back to the 5 furlongs would benefit at all, because it does seem like she takes a little while to really to hit her best stride and get totally into top gear. And we saw that again in this race. So those are all the Breeders' Cup preps. There were quite a few of them that we're going to mention this week. I think things will slow down a little bit in the next couple of weeks as we have a few stakes races. There are definitely more coming at Keeneland, although I don't think most of them will be considered prep races for the Breeders' Cup. I think they run the Queen Elizabeth next week, which once in a while produces a Breeders' Cup starter, but maybe not this year. We'll see. But we'll talk about all of those races in the coming weeks. I assume on one of these podcasts at some point, we'll do a more in-depth Breeders' Cup preview to sort out these races and talk through some of the contenders. So look for all of that content coming up. For now, as always, you can listen to the TimeformUS Pacecast and the TimeformUS Forecast on drep.com, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, or SoundCloud, wherever you get your podcast. Just subscribe to the Daily Racing Form and listen to us. Thanks for listening this week, guys, and we'll be back at you again on Friday, the TimeformUS Forecast.